Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast alternates between an interview and an unpacking scholarship where I talk about some research in relation to CS education. This week's particular episode is a continuation of a discussion on gender-related publications that are relevant to CS educators. In particular, this week's episode is unpacking the paper titled, How Early Does the CS Gender Gap Emerge? A Study of Collaborative Problem Solving in 5th Grade Computer Science. This paper was written by Jennifer Tsan, Christy Elizabeth Boyer, and Colin F. Lynch. Apologies if I mispronounce any names. As always, you can find links to this particular paper in the show notes by clicking on the article title, or you can find more publications by other authors by clicking on their names, and it'll take you to their Google Scholar profile. All right, so here's the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, Elementary computer science has gained increasing attention with the computer science education research community. We have only recently begun to explore the many unanswered questions about how young students learn computer science, how they interact with each other, and how their skill levels and backgrounds vary. One set of unanswered questions focuses on gender equality for young computer science educators. This paper examines how the gender composition of collaborative groups in elementary computer science relates to student achievement. We report on data collected from an in-school 5th grade computer science elective offered over 4 quarters in 2014 to 2015. We found a significant difference in the quality of artifacts produced by learner groups depending on their gender composition, with groups of all-female students performing significantly lower than other groups. Our analyses suggest important factors that are influential as these learners begin to solve computer science problems. This new evidence of gender disparities in computer science achievements as young as 10 years of age highlights the importance of future studies on these factors in order to provide effective, equitable computer science education to learners of all ages. End quote. Now, if I were to summarize this particular study into a single sentence, I would say that this paper investigates the potential impact of gendered groups on the quality of completed Scratch projects in an in-school computer science class for 5th grade students. All right, so in the introduction of this paper, the authors describe how there's a difference in gender within like post-secondary, high school, and even middle school classes. However, there was very little research at the time of this publication on the gender differences in elementary school. The authors note that in particular math has shown some gender differences as young as 1st grade. So considering that there are some differences in that grade level or age group, the authors are going to investigate whether or not there are some gender differences within 5th grade students. Now, before actually doing this particular study, they did a pilot group with an after-school class. And they co-developed this class with an elementary school teacher. And then after completing this pilot and doing some revisions and whatnot, they then implemented this class across 4 different quarters, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So this particular paper is guided by the question, how is gender composition of collaborative groups in elementary computer science related to student achievement? And that question's from page 388. And here's a 2-sentence summary of the findings. Quote, we collected students' programs from one project in the 5th grade computer science course. These programs were rated for quality, and the results showed that all female groups produced significantly lower scored artifacts than groups with at least one male. End quote. From page 389. Okay, so the next section of the paper talks about some related work. So they highlight some areas of elementary school interventions, such as like using other platforms for computer science, as well as some discussions around collaboration in elementary school. Now, under that particular section on collaboration in elementary school, there's an interesting quote from page 389. Quote, outside of computer science, a study of elementary students' collaboration revealed that female-to-male relationships in subjects such as physical education, reading, language art, social studies, and art are not equal. Boys appear to benefit more from female-to-male pairings by developing their leadership skills and increasing their self-efficacy in problem-solving, whereas these pairings can reinforce gender stereotypes for girls. End quote. So that is a very interesting finding. If you are engaging in paired programming, you'll likely want to read some more research on this finding and to figure out why is it that this kind of pairing might be beneficial for male students but detrimental to female students. Maybe I'll find some particular papers to discuss this in future Unpacking Scholarship episodes. All right, so the next section of the paper talks about some context. So the teacher who was doing this had no formal background in computer science, and the class that this was occurring in was a 30-day, 45-minute class time that occurred in a quarterly rotation. So new students would appear every quarter. The demographics were 53.1% African American, 32.6% Caucasian, and 14.3% Hispanic, Latino, Native American, Asian, or mixed race. And 47.4% of students received free or reduced lunch. So those stats are on page 390. Those were basically a verbatim restatement of them. Now, in this school year, throughout each of the quarters, there were a total of 55 students in this elective class, 16 of which were girls and 39 of which were boys. There was no mention of non-binary, so I actually don't know whether or not they investigated whether there were non-binary individuals in this class, or at least people who identified as non-binary at that time. Because if you would ask me when I was this age group, I would have identified as male, but it wasn't until a few years ago where I was able to finally find some language that described how I actually feel and identify as a non-binary individual. So in this class, these students completed 3 major projects. 2 of them were Scratch programming projects, and 1 was a research project on computer science and society. So this particular study looked at the first programming project. So this particular project was to create a fairy tale in Scratch. The students were required to incorporate 2 instances of cause and effect from the fairy tale and 2 instances of user input where the user's input decided the path the story took. End quote. From page 390. All right, so the next section of this particular paper takes a look at 18 pairs of groups. 4 were all female, 4 were male and female pairings, and then 10 were all male. And then there's also 1 individual who didn't work with a group. Now, you'll already notice that there is quite a gender imbalance in this, so the results are going to obviously be a bit skewed in terms of having a much smaller sample size of female students and a much larger sample size of male students. But as with all studies that are like this, follow-up studies are important to figure out, is this generalizable? And if so, where and how and why? All right, so in this particular study, the things that they're analyzing with the projects themselves were looking at the requirements, like whether or not they actually had 2 instances of user input and cause and effect. They also looked at the consistency, so whether the project actually ran consistently, so like resetting the sprites if needed at the start of the project. And then usability, so whether there were some prompts to like guide the user to figure out how to engage with this story. So they did weight this so that 70% of the weight was going towards the requirements, 20% of the weight was going towards the consistency, and then 10% was going towards the usability. Now, here's a quote from page 390 that kind of summarizes the overall results. Quote, "The programs of all 4 all-female groups scored below the median, and the scores were clustered together. The scores of the female-male groups were also relatively close to each other, with their lowest scores being equal to the highest score of the all-female groups, and their highest score being slightly lower than most of the all-male groups. The all-male groups displayed the widest range of scores, with both the highest and lowest scoring groups out of all the categories. However, note that the all-male group was also the largest, with an N of 10. 70% of the all-male groups scored 0.77 or higher." End quote. And to clarify, the maximum score you could receive is a 1. So in other words, 70% of all the male groups scored at least 77% or higher out of the total possible score. So on the next page on 390, here's a following quote. Quote, "The results revealed that none of the all-female groups and 64% of the at least 1 male groups achieved a high code score. The difference was statistically significant, with a p-value of 0.04. We also examined the all-male group, N of 10, and at least 1 female, N of 8, groups separately. In the split, 70% of all male groups and 25% of at least 1 female group achieved high code scores, and this difference was not statistically significant, the p-value of 0.08. End quote. Okay, now interestingly, they give a few examples of case studies. So the first one that they give is of an individual. And they point out that this particular individual scored the highest possible score, and that they had experience participating in the after-school pilot program that occurred in the spring before this school year. The next case study they talk about is a female-to-male pair, and they found that there were some interpersonal collaboration and communication issues that kind of negatively impacted the overall process. The next case study that they talk about is a female-to-female pair, and how they had good interpersonal communication and collaboration because they were friends. And although their code did run consistently and they did have some user prompts, the actual conversations were incoherent. So the fairy tale didn't really make sense, according to the people who assessed this. And the last group that they provide a case study for is a male-to-male pairing. And although they worked well together, they were kind of distracted by looking at other projects, and they scored low compared to the other all-male groups. All right, so the next section of this particular paper is on the discussions and the limitations. So the first section talks about supporting design and planning. So they're basically saying that this process could go a lot better for partner groups and for just creating in general, by engaging in some supportive processes for learning how to design and plan for creating a project. So for example, in your class, you might engage in storyboarding or pseudocoding, where you write out a rough outline or framework for what you want to happen and how it will happen with some of the code that you could use in whatever platform you're using or language. This is especially important for large projects or even some smaller projects if kids are less familiar with programming. So the next section under the discussion is on fostering collaborative skills and practices. And they were discussing how it's important to try and identify some good collaborative habits with the students, and how these collaborative skills can be not only beneficial for the projects that are being created in the computer science class, but also just in life in general, in career or leisure. The next section that they talk about is investigating cognitive and social constructs. So I'm going to read a quote from here because this is important to consider. This is from page 392. Quote, differences in performance at young ages is almost certainly related in part to influences that occur prior to the class itself. For example, there is a systematic gender difference between toys marketed to young children. Legos and robots are more likely to be marketed for boys, while dolls and kitchen sets are more likely to be marketed for girls. It is possible that the traditionally boy toys foster spatial and programmatic reasoning skills more than the traditionally girl toys. And recent literature suggests a correlation between spatial reasoning and computer science performance, end quote. And the boy toys and girl toys were in quotes. So this really relates to what I talked about 2 weeks ago in that Unpacking Scholarship episode, where I talk about how technology positions and careers in Malaysia are dominated by women, statistically speaking. So if you haven't listened to that episode or the other episodes related to gender, I highly recommend checking those out. I'll include links to those in the show notes. All right, and in this particular section of the paper finishes with a discussion on some of the limitations. I'm going to skip those, but basically it's talking about small sample size, how the course changed over each one of the quarters, so you can't really compare quarter 1 to quarter 4 because the teacher was continuing to refine and improve, etc. All right, so the paper concludes with the discussion on future work, and here's a quote from page 393. Quote, classroom observations suggested that a difference did exist, and results demonstrated that all female groups achieved significantly lower program quality than groups with at least one male. The analyses suggest that numerous factors play important roles, including the extent to which students were willing to engage in design, students' collaborative practices, and other cognitive and social factors, end quote. So this quote kind of leads into what I'd like to talk about next, which are some of my lingering questions or thoughts on this particular paper. So one question that I have is, how might the gender and confidence of a teacher impact learning? So, as an example, if a female teacher expressed that they didn't know much because it was their first time doing programming or coding, would it negatively impact female students' own perceptions of how they might be able to do in coding or computer science? However, if the teacher is female and they express confidence, would that have increased any of the confidence in the female students? And how would this change for male teachers or non-binary or trans teachers? In other words, what is the impact or potential impact that a teacher might have in relation to their self-efficacy or confidence with coding and teaching coding? So if I was in the classroom and I was expressing some hesitation about doing something or learning something or teaching something, students related to my different identities may have also expressed some hesitation or been like, well, if Jared can't do it, then I don't know if I can do it. But I don't know. Now, the question that I have is, how would the findings have changed over time? So the authors do mention that they analyzed the first project, but what would happen if you compared the first with the last project? Would there be any differences in amount of growth or in final product quality? So for example, if the female and female groups were scoring the lowest on the first project, did they make the highest gains in terms of overall score on their final project? Or did they remain at the same overall scoring? Or just scale with a relative amount of increase as the other groups? Also, how might the findings have changed if the groups had improved their collaboration skills? The authors do mention that multiple groups didn't do so well, and it might have been because they weren't really great at collaborating and working with each other. So one thing we might need to consider as CS educators is not just about learning the content, but it's also about being able to facilitate collaboration with other students and learning from and working with peers. Another question that I have is, how might the results change if we accounted for prior experience? So for example, accounting for prior experience with computers, prior experience with creating stories, prior experience playing video games, prior experience coding, like one of the case studies, one of the students was engaging in the pilot program that was after school, or even just experience going home and being able to actually continue to work on the project at home since Scratch is online. How might all of these factors impact the overall quality of the final product. And what is missing from the final product that could be learned by actually chatting with the students? Like, oh, what didn't you include and why? In other research that I've read, some of the researchers have mentioned that the final product was poor, but it was because students ultimately ended up throwing away much of their work rather than leaving it in their project. So they may have scored a higher score if they had kept it in, but they ultimately didn't like it, so they just removed it, which gave the false impression that they didn't understand what they were supposed to do or were incapable of doing it. Or really they were, they just didn't like the overall end product. So they essentially erased their work. The final question that I have is, how would the results change for trans students? So for example, would we find similar results for trans masculine students and males? And what about trans feminine students and females? What about non-binary, non-conforming, genderqueer, etc., folks who exist outside of leaning towards one of the binaries that is often presented with gender? So to be more concrete with what I'm saying, if you had a female and female group, a male and male group, and a non-binary and non-binary group, and we were to take the stats of this particular study, would the female and female score the lowest, the non-binary and non-binary score in the middle, and the male and male score the highest? If so, why? Obviously, this is all hypothetical, but it's important to consider. It's also important to consider that while these studies are helpful to think through these things, we can't generalize and say, oh, well, because of this, now I know that my female and female pairings are just obviously going to score lower than my male to male pairings in the classes that I work with. No, we can't make that conclusion. But we can look at this and use it as a heuristic and say, I wonder why that is, and how can I improve upon the pairings in my class? So as an example, I personally preferred to allow kids to determine whether they wanted to work in groups or work on their own. I was one of those kind of students who always preferred to work on my own, even if it meant doubling my amount of work. I just learned more that way, and I enjoyed that process. When students did want to pair with each other, I made sure that they were getting along and that they were both learning from this experience. So for example, the article mentions every 15 minutes, like switching between who's the driver and who's the navigator. That can work, but some students prefer to be the driver and some students prefer to be the navigator. As long as they can both understand what is going on, that was fine with me. And for me, I also encouraged groups that were larger than just pairs, as long as everybody could be actively engaged and demonstrate they all understand what was going on. Totally cool with me. But those were just my approaches, so you might have some other approaches. All right, so that concludes this week's particular episode and this little mini-series on gender. I will certainly talk about it more in future interviews and unpacking scholarship episodes, but I hope this little mini-series gave you some things to consider in relation to gender and CS education. If it did, please consider sharing one of these episodes with somebody you know, and thank you so much for listening to this particular episode. I hope you have a safe and wonderful week.